Hi, everyone. This is Daniil Karapkin, speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario in Canada, with Beth Avraham Yosef of Toronto Congregation. And you are watching webyeshiva.org live, both on Facebook and on the webyeshiva.org platform from Israel. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, which is Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are embarking now on chapter 72 of the first section today. And let's just get our bearings. The Rambam had explained to us that in these final chapters of the first section of the three sections of Moreh Nevukhim, he would be trying to explain to us his general subscription to Aristotelian philosophy in contradistinction to other religious philosophers of his time, both that were part of Judaism, his own faith, and are part of other faiths, namely Islam and Christianity. He feels that these religious philosophers have erred in their methodology, and he needs to therefore set the record straight and show that for the most part, Aristotelian philosophy is accurate and is a fair description of reality and of God, with certain exceptions where that Aristotelian philosophy has overly speculated and has come to the wrong conclusions through that speculation. He also pointed out to us at the end of chapter 71 that the most accurate way, and really the only way, to get an understanding of God is by looking around the world, looking at reality, and inferring facts about God from our observation of that which is, that which exists. And so he basically set out for us at the end of chapter 71 the four projects, the four objectives that he would like to accomplish before he arrives at the end of this section of Moreh Nevukhim. So we have four more chapters, 72, 74, 75, and 76. And these four chapters will map out the four projects of the Rambam before he finishes this section. The first is to present to us the science of his day and let us know what exists and how things exist and their relationship to God. And that's what he basically said is my first project that I'm going to be setting out for you now, is just to give you the sort of a schematic of the universe, of the world. And that's what we're going to do now in chapter 72. In subsequent chapters, I'm going to, the Rambam says, lay out for you the methodology of the Mutakalimun, which I've already explained to you is in some way flawed. In the following chapter, I will lay out for you Aristotelian philosophy and methodology. And then finally, I will lay out for you in the final chapter what I, Maimonides, opine as far as how I reconcile the Torah and the Aristotelian philosophy of my day. But let's start with chapter 72. Now, there's very little that we're going to be seeing inside today. I don't think we'll be seeing anything inside today. It's quite a long chapter. It's about 12 pages long in the Pines edition. It starts on page 184 of the English edition that was translated by Dr. Shlomo Pines. And so instead, I have an outline for you. And I'd like to display that on the screen so that you can see the outline. And I hope that it'll make life a little bit easier for you. So just give me a moment and I will display that on the screen. Okay, so I think I have to close a few windows first before I'm able to do that for you. Just give me one moment, please. And here we go. Okay, so here's our outline. It'll take us a few minutes just to go through the outline and understand where the Rambam is coming from. Now, I just want to present, so the title of our discussion today is How the World Works Scientifically and Man as Microcosm. And we'll explain what that means in just a moment. The world is completely unitary. And that is the reason why the world is a reflection of God, because the unitary world is a reflection of its unitary creator. So that's the first point the Rambam makes in this chapter, is that you can look at the world and see a representation or some kind of depiction of God in the world. The second point that he makes is that man, the human being, is a microcosm of the world. And therefore, you can look at the human being, get an understanding of the world, and through therefore man, you can get an understanding of God as well. And just a few points that the Rambam makes throughout the chapter. We'll come back to this because this is an important underlying current throughout this chapter. Just as a man has constituent parts but still remains unitary, so for the world. The world is comprised of so many different parts, and yet it is still one whole. Just like a human being has bones and skin and different parts, the lower part and the upper parts and the middle parts of the body, different organs and so forth. The world also is made up of different components, but yet it still makes up one unitary whole. Secondly, just as some parts of man's body are governed by other parts, so for example, the motion of the heart controls many other organs, so is the motion of the heavens controlling all elemental existence in our world. And that means that not everything in our world is uniform. Some things control others. And the Rambam's main scientific principle is that, based on Aristotelian science, is that the heavenly bodies, in a sense, control the functioning of the world that we perceive down here, which is comprised of four elements. And we're going to talk about these four elements very shortly. Similarly, every human soul is in some way rooted in the spiritual realm of heaven. And so when we go to the idea of a human being being very similar to the world, we note that just like the heavenly spheres that exist in heaven, and remember, when we use the word sphere, and we'll get to this in just a moment, we're talking about a Ptolemaic planetary model where the Earth is in the center and it is surrounded by concentric spheres that are transparent but which form the orbit of the various heavenly bodies. Imagine, if you will, just a bunch of concentric beach balls which are completely transparent but which have written on them stars and planets, and they're constantly in motion. And that's how medieval science viewed the patterns of motion, that they were able to calculate mathematically and see how the stars move. This model worked scientifically to help with navigation and everything else that was needed in order to help man relate in some way to the stars. This scientific model, as perhaps erroneous as it appears to us today, worked for man's utility in the medieval world. So the motion of the heavens controls all elemental existence, and similarly, man's soul is also controlled or is also in some way rooted in the heavens. And just as a person would die if his heart stopped beating, so would the world as we know it cease to exist without the motion of the heavenly spheres. In this sense, the whole world is like a singular human being, possessed of a soul and in constant motion. Just like our heart is constantly beating, so too the celestial spheres are constantly in motion. Man is thus known as an olam katan, a microcosmic world, a miniature world, or a world that, or man is representative of the entire world. And we're going to come back to this topic at the end of the chapter. Number three, the world is bounded by an outer sphere, closest to God, and contains a series of concentric transparent spheres. These spheres form the orbits of the various planets and the celestial bodies. The sphere closest to our physical life, the world that we relate to with all of the physical matter that we encounter in our existence, that is called the lunar sphere. It's known in Aristotelian science as the sphere closest to the Earth, and it contains the orbit of the moon. That was the understanding, is that since the moon appears to us closest of all of the other celestial bodies, it must be embedded within the sphere that is closest to our planet. And what's also important for the Rambam to point out to us is that there is no vacuum in the world, because a vacuum would imply a lack of singularity in the world. Everything is interconnected. There's no such thing as any spaces or gaps within the things that exist in the world. And that is what the atomists believe. And we are not atomists. If you recall, the Rambam had made reference to atomism of the world being comprised of fragments or segments of items, and there are gaps or vacuum between those segments. And he did the same thing with chronology, and he felt that that was a mistaken view of the world. There's no fluidity and no continuum in that kind of world, and the Rambam therefore rejects that. Number 4, each of the concentric spheres moves steadily without acceleration or deceleration, but each at a different speed and a different orbit. Some of these spheres have the Earth as the center of its orbit, where the Earth is the midpoint of that sphere, but others revolve around the Earth without the Earth as its center, a lopsided orbit, if you will. And this was, again, a way of mathematically explaining some of the uneven orbits that they noted of the stars. The fastest moving sphere, which causes motion of the other spheres, is the outermost sphere. And C, every celestial body does not move on its own, but is rather embedded in its respective sphere. Now, you might be scratching your head, at some point in our discussion and saying, what's the point of our trying to break down this chapter and understand what the Rambam is telling us? Why don't we just chalk up this chapter to being, fake science or outdated science? None of this is scientifically accurate based on our understanding of the motion of the heavenly bodies in our world today using modern physics, Newtonian physics, and certainly, atomism is the understood science of today. So the purpose of this exercise is not to suggest that we're going to go back to subscribing to an Aristotelian understanding of science and cosmology, but rather the objective is to see where the Rambam is coming from and how he uses his observation of the world to infer the existence of God. The purpose of the exercise is to apply the methodology of the Rambam to modern day science. And if the Rambam feels that he can use the science of his day to infer God and to find God in creation, then that's our responsibility as well. He would say the same thing. I mean, we can venture that if the Rambam were alive today and someone would tell him, Rabbi, you've got the entire scientific model incorrect because you were living in a time when Aristotelianism was the science. But since then, we've gone on to Newtonianism, and we're sorry, but that's a wake-up call. The Rambam would be shocked probably for a little while. He would have to think this through, but then he would say, well, this new model also helps us to find God in creation, and here's how we're going to find him. Now, it may not be as easy today because of the laws of motion do not require a God who is constantly maintaining the motion of heavenly bodies, as was the belief in the times of the Rambam. But nonetheless, the Rambam, I think, would feel that the project is still a worthy and a worthwhile project, and a completely workable project, even in the face of modern science. Okay, let's go on to number 5. Some features of the celestial realm are matters of theory and speculation. The Rambam clearly acknowledges that in this chapter, and he says we don't know everything. There are some theories, and those theories have not yet been completely proven, such as we're unsure if some spheres exist in space that do not orbit the Earth, or if all of the spheres orbit the Earth in some way, either circularly or elliptically. So we're agnostic about that, and there's different theories. So that already gives us an idea that the Rambam is willing to acknowledge that Aristotelian science of his day has gotten some things undoubtedly accurate because they've been proven, but there are other things that are still in the realm of theory. And he also says another example is we don't know for sure how many spheres there are, but the number is not less than 18. And he's getting this clearly out of the scientific textbooks, which basically trace the motions in the orbits of the heavenly bodies. And they were able to note at least 18 different patterns of movement that are not consistent with one sphere moving, but rather with multiple spheres moving different heavenly bodies. Now we're going to talk about the elements. In between the lunar sphere and our Earth are contained the 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And he goes from top to bottom to top. The Earth is the heaviest of the elements, and therefore it is the most down below on this Earth. Then water is on top of that, air is on top of water, and fire is on top of Air, because the Aristotelian belief is that warmth does not come from the sun, but rather comes from a layer of fire that is above the air that wafts its way down to our planet and provides the humankind and all of that exists with warmth. Now, there is a fifth element that transcends the other four elements and is what the celestial bodies are comprised of. The lunar sphere contains beneath it a primordial form of matter, this fifth matter, which breaks down into the four forms, and these forms give rise to the four elements of matter with their respective qualities. So, this fifth element not only is the ingredient that makes up the celestial bodies, but it also, in some way, once it comes down to below the lunar sphere, breaks down and gives rise to the four elements that have more defined features than this fifth sort of undefined element. D, the elements are inanimate and have no sentience. They are acted upon and do not act independently, other than conforming to their own natural properties. And what are the natural properties? Well, it depends. Earth and water tend to move from higher points to lower points, whereas the natural properties of air and fire move to higher points. Because the fifth element is placed into motion by the lunar sphere and it's constantly moving, it causes motion to occur to the other four elements, and it causes these elements, therefore, to combine and to move to places which are not their natural state of rest. But because these compounds are temporary, therefore, earth will combine with water and which will combine with air and fire, and you'll get composite um, structures in this world. Like, you'll get plant life and animal life and minerals and things like that. But all of these things eventually break down and return to their individual elements. Ultimately, everything returns back to its original state and is in a state of motion in this respect, just like the spheres rotate and eventually return to their original position. So while it's true that the elements do not have any independent motion on their own, but they are caused to move, but there is a sense of constant motion in our planet down below, even though we're not a sphere that's rotating, but nevertheless there's still motion because there's constant construction and deconstruction, building and breaking down of the elements. So there's constant motion, there's constant change that's taking place. Number 7, the spheres, in contrast to the elements, possess souls and, as will be demonstrated later, have sentience. And that sentience perhaps is represented in Tanakh through the angels, because the celestial bodies in a certain way can be represented as angels in another terminology. And also, unlike the elements, they are constantly in motion independently, not being moved, but moving themselves. Number 8, the four forces that come from heaven to this world is that there are four things that sort of cause things to move in our world. And there are four of those forces. A, that which causes the elements to combine, affecting mineral existence. B, that which grants vegetable spirits to all plant life. C, that which grants animating spirit to all animal life. And D, that which grants intellect to man. All of these things are emanated from a heavenly source, and they cause all of these changes to occur and all of these phenomena to occur in our world. Number 9, nature is the term used by philosophers to denote the way the world operates and safeguards all of the constituent components of the world, making sure they operate normally. We find this term usable and acceptable for our purposes as well, even though there's an aversion in religion to use the term nature, because nature almost tends to write God out of the picture, but it doesn't necessarily have to do so. God is responsible for the laws of nature, and therefore we can use that term. B, the term is also used by physicians in noting the way the body maintains its constituent organs and limbs. C, it is speculative as to whether this nature force is emanated from an intermediary sphere or from God himself. We don't know for sure. And going back to the human body, to medicine, vital organs of the body vary very little from one person to another. For example, people's liver size varies only slightly from one person to another. But by contrast, there are certain bodily features and parts which vary much more diversely if these parts of the body are not vital organs, but rather exist in order to serve vital organs or vital functions of the body. So, for example, hairiness and skin. These are not vital organs, as far as, how much hair I have and what color of my skin, how much pigmentation my skin will have. And that's the reason why they vary widely from person to person. So the Rambam is really giving us sort of an explanation as to why certain things are consistent across all species, right? Or let's say within one species, you find a certain kinds of organs or features are consistent throughout, and why other features of that species vary more dramatically. Why do different people have different skin color or different levels of hairiness, whereas everyone has the same size liver or kidney and so forth? And the answer is it's dependent upon the level of vitality, of necessity of that organ. The more necessary and vital the organ is, the more uniform it tends to be. The less vital that organ or that feature of the body is, the more diversity you will find in nature. Similarly, certain species are vital and will thus be reproduced in an orderly fashion, whereas other species are non-vital, such as worms, that generate spontaneously in the science of the Rambam's time, and will thus generate spontaneously with less specificity and order. F, the same principle holds true for the world in general. Certain components of nature are everlasting and vital, such as the fifth element and the basic four elements, but other compound structures are not permanently vital and therefore decompose and disappear over time. So the more vital the component of the world is, the more lasting and consistent it is. The less vital, the more it's given to vicissitudes and breakdown over the course of time. Okay, number 10. Certain forces exist within the human being that are responsible for his coming into being and being maintained. And those are the very same forces which cause a man to become ill and eventually to die. So this world is a system whereby man has everything that he needs in order to give rise to his existence and to nourish him and maintain him. But it is those very same ingredients of reality that eventually cause him to break down. So, for example, man possesses what in Aristotelianism is called an attractive faculty, which means the thing that causes him to bring things to himself and to ingest them. I have a natural instinct to eat, right? So that's my attractive faculty, right? But this self same faculty causes me to ingest other things which make me sick and cause me to eventually die. So the belief in the Rambam's time is that if a person were to eat exclusively only those things which are meant to maintain and nourish his body, he could potentially live far, far longer than he lives today. But because, as part of man's diet, he ingests both healthy things and unhealthy things, the food that he ingests eventually causes him to die. And the same principle exists in all of nature. That which causes the elements to combine in a proper and healthy manner to produce beneficial phenomena also causes natural disasters as a result of an unhealthy combination of forces and elements. But it's the same rules of science that cause things to work well, and those very same rules will tend to cause tsunamis and tornadoes and floods and so forth and so on. And number 11, and this is probably the thrust or really the underlying current of this entire chapter, man is uniquely olam katan because of his unique intellect. Now, there are other creatures in this world who you might argue are a microcosm of the universe based on what we've used to explain how man is a microcosm. You could take a cow, for example, and say that cow has a beating heart. And just like the celestial bodies, their motion causes the maintenance of the physical world, a cow's beating heart causes the maintenance of the cow's body. But there's one unique feature of man, which is that he possesses an intellect, which makes him the most analogous to the existence of the entire world. Because all other living creatures' natures are similar to man, except for man's intellect. B, man is dependent upon his rational faculty for survival, unlike other animals who can exist in the wild without the exercise of their intellect. They live on instinct alone. But man's intellect is the key to his survival due to his more fragile physical makeup and his need to invest more effort in his shelter and his nourishment. You put a human being in the wild, and he is less likely to thrive and survive than a wolf or some other kind of animal whose habitat is in the wild. And therefore, man relies more on his intellect for his survival. And that in itself is much more descriptive of how our world is maintained, because our world is also maintained by ultimately an intellect. Man is also more dependent upon community to help him create provisions for himself, where each person contributes something different to the collective. But the point being here is that just as man's intellect sustains him, and without his intellect he would perish, so is there an intellect of the world, which is God, without whom the world would cease to exist. And thus God is known as the life force of the world, as in reference to the book of Daniel, where an angel swears, Bechei ha'olam, that he swears by the life of the world. God is the life force of the world. Just like man's intellect is responsible for keeping man alive, so too God is the intellect of the universe, and God here is described not surprisingly by the Rambam as the ultimate intellect, and God is the sustainer of the world. But with all of that said, that we've created all of these analogies between the human being um, and uh, and and the way that God maintains the universe, we must point out that the analogy between God and the human intellect must be clarified in that there are three important differences. Difference number one, the human who controls his various organs and constituent parts benefits from those constituents, whereas God does not benefit in any way from the components of the world which he moves. God is the ultimate giver who gives without any expectation of reciprocation. So that's an important distinction. The human intellect is dependent upon its body for sustenance, but God is not dependent upon any component of the world for his sustenance. God is completely independent and exists independently of his world. And therefore, he's purely giving and is not benefiting in any way from that giving. Number two, the heart, which controls and moves the other organs of the body, is protected by those organs by being in their center. We have our heart in the center of our body in order to protect it. Similarly, the brain, although the Rama doesn't say that, is encased in a skull to protect it because those are the most vital organs which are constantly in motion in some way and are activating and giving health and life to the rest of the body. But for God, it's just the opposite. He not only gives life by his constant motion, but he is the ultimate protector because he is contained outside of the world, outside the outermost sphere of our world. He surrounds the organs, as it were, of the world. But while the Rambam has said that, he says the similarity between the two is also that the closer the constituent organ is to the heart, the more vital it is. Right next to my heart, I have my lungs, I have my liver, I have my diaphragm, all of the things that are vital to the existence of my body. So therefore, the Rambam points out that in the human anatomy, the closer the organ is to the heart, the more vital it is. The same thing happens to be true with the celestial realm. The closer that the sphere is to God on the outside, the loftier and holier it is. And we've talked a little bit about this before when we talked about in a previous chapter about all of the different components that the Talmud and Tractate Chagiga itemizes for us. The holiest and loftiest of things that exist in this world are contained in the outermost sphere, which are closest to God, who is like the beating heart. Okay, and the third difference between looking at the human model and the divine model is that human intellect cannot exist without a human body, but God can and does exist independently of his world, very similar to the first point that we made. And finally, our the last 2 points, the Rambam says, I could have analogized more accurately if I would have distinguished between two aspects of the human intellect. One is that which we call the rational faculty within man, which is innately endowed within every human being who is, let's say, has a normal thinking process. And there's a second component of human rationality or intellect, and that's called acquired intellect. And in Aristotelian science, the belief is that you are born with an innate ability to think, but in addition to your innate ability to think, you are endowed with those eureka moments of life where you obtain external intellect through the efforts that you make on your own to attenuate and develop your own natural thinking processes. In other words, it's almost like two bodies coming to meet each other. The harder you work your brain, your mind, the more that this external intellect comes closer and closer to you and endows you with intellect from without. We're going to develop this idea further when we get to section 2. But the point is, the Rambam says, is that you can bifurcate the whole concept of human intellect into these two parts. And it would have been more apt for me to essentially therefore say that man's innate rational faculty is more like the innate intellects of the celestial bodies, whereas man's acquired intellect is separate from him, from his innate human intellect, and thus more analogous to God. However, he says, the reason why I have not created those um, microcosmic analogies in that more in-depth way is because both the topics of acquired intellect and celestial intellects are speculative and require more detailed research and analysis, and that is why I have simplified my discussion to discuss human intellect in general. And finally, the Rambam says, I have presented these ideas to you and they are absolutely clear and proven. In other words, he concludes his chapter by basically saying that everything that I've presented to you in this chapter about Aristotelian science, I have not taken the time to prove what I have argued because they're already contained in the textbooks. This is the science of our day. Like the difference of trying to explain to you how our solar system works and proving that this is how we know this is how the solar system works, right? So the Rambam basically says, I'm not taking the time to prove these things to you. That would take far too long. But a scholar, whom I'm hoping you are, says the Rambam, will go ahead and prove these ideas if you are not certain of their truth. And if you want, go out, purchase a textbook about Aristotelian science, use the syllogisms and proofs that are used there to prove the points that I've presented to you, and then these ideas will become even more deeply embedded and ensconced within your psyche and in your mind. And that would be a worthwhile endeavor, says the Rambam, but that's not my objective in this work. If you wish to accept it from me on faith, you can, with the understanding that I have studied these things very, very carefully. I have accepted the proofs that prove that these things that I have said are true. And therefore, finally quoting from the book of Job, Hinezos chakarnuha kenhi. I've delved into it. I've discovered how true it is. Shema'ena ve'ata dalach. Hear it and you will know it. And that's the way the Rambam really concludes his chapter. And he basically tells us, and now I'm going on to the next topic, which is to discuss the Mutakalimun and their methodology. And that's what we're going to start chapter 73 with next time. All right, and this is the end of our discussion for today. And I hope that you have a good rest of the week. And we will continue with this discussion of the Mutakalimun next time. Take care, everybody.